You are listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place. No cap. This bop slaps. So settle in for another banger with your co-host that kicks flavor in your ear, Charlie Mushaw.
What did that even mean?
I told you I was going to get you. As an elder millennial, that's for all my colleagues sending and receiving their tick snaps.
Okay. Yeah. I literally have no idea what half of that meant. I am so old.
I was just looking at the demographics of the folks that, because we get metrics.
Yeah.
And I realized that I really appreciate our younger listeners, but I realized that we don't have a lot of them. So I was just trying to connect. How do you do, fellow kids?
Well, I hope that they have some other way to meet me in the middle. So let's get really engaged with the youth by talking about really old stuff.
I told you I was going to throw you off. So behind the scenes information, we are on a time crunch on this one. And Michael goes, I'm going to try to keep it short. And I said, I'm going to try to mess you up in the first 5 minutes.
That's okay. That was well worth it. I'm going to go back and study that and try to dissect it later. I'll diagram the sentences and thus learn what the parts of it are.
Would you like to introduce yourself? I feel like I derailed you so hard you didn't even do your... Hello, Michael.
Follow me for more outdated linguistic tips. I'm your other co-host, multi-award-winning novelist Michael G. Williams. All spooky season I've been saying how weird it is, even before that, how weird it is to say that in front of people. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about this week, and you know what? I don't care that it's weird to say it in front of people. Something that we've talked about before, nobody's ever going to rep you but yourself. Quite frankly. So I'm going to rep myself with that, and I am not going to feel weird about it. So
speaking of repping yourself, you should vote for us in the WRAL Voters' Choice Awards.
Indeed, because this episode is going to come out on the 30th of October, and that means there will be a clean 21 days still that people can vote. And there will be a link to go directly to our place on the ballot in the show notes to this episode. Go to the app or site where you are listening, and you will find that link, and you can click it.
If you don't like show notes, you can go to wral.com/BCAS, and we are in the category professional and entertainment under podcast. And we are the very first choice. Don't even need to read the other ones because nothing else matters.
Nope.
Sincerely, though, we do really appreciate the folks that got us there by voting for nomination. And we make jokes, but we really are humbled by that. And we appreciate every vote.
Absolutely. So today we're going to talk about the Maco light, which is an old legend that a lot of people have asked us to talk about. Mm-hmm. And we are going to close out spooky season by talking about it.
Yeah, there's a couple big old granddaddy episodes that we have sat on because we're like, all right, this is a big one. We got to save this.
Yeah.
And this one is so big. When I say big, I mean popular in history, that the North Carolina Board of Tourism actually used to use it as a marketing tool.
Absolutely, they did. In fact, we'll talk a little bit about that kind of mention of it in the course of this episode.
Then I will shut up.
No, you're good.
I will get out of the way of this freight train.
You are all good. Oh, I see what you did there.
Jokes and jokes and jokes.
So let's talk about Maco before colonists showed up. The area around Wilmington, North Carolina, because Maco is a community, sort of still is a community, about, several miles inland from Wilmington. That area was originally populated by Native American people that we know today as the Cape Fear Indians, quote unquote. But we call them that because their name for themselves is long lost to us. We do not know what they called themselves. Some researchers for the Smithsonian Institute have theorized that their name for themselves was the Dawhee, Dawhee, but that is a theory and nobody really knows. We know that they had multiple towns in their territory, but the only one we know the name of was called Necos, Necoes, and that one was described as approximately 20 miles inland from the mouth of the Cape Fear River. So they had a pretty sizable area and a pretty small population. In fact, so little is known about them that we're not even sure exactly what language they spoke. It is widely believed that they were a Siouan people, and in part that's because the Cape Fear River formed a boundary. To the south of it, down to where there's now Savannah, Georgia, there were Siouan-speaking people. North of it, all the way up the east coast into what's now New England and now Canada, were all mostly Algonquin-speaking people. And the handful of explorers who had any contact with the people that we call the Cape Fear Indians said, at the very least, we know that they don't speak Algonquin. So there were not a lot of other options around. Also, some other clues. There's some very limited archaeological finds related to them. And their pottery, whether it was made locally or traded from elsewhere, it was decorated in the Siouan style rather than the Algonquin style. Siouan pottery tended to be just sort of decorated with pigments, and Algonquin pottery tended to be decorated with shells, and their pottery was not decorated with shells. Of the very few things we know about their culture, the two most interesting things are they had a ritual that was referred to as the black drink. And it was this incredibly thick, incredibly caffeinated beverage that they would drink in large quantities. They would like binge on this drink and then subsequently purge as a result of having consumed it. And then they would have this big event where they kind of like smashed up a bunch of pottery and threw a bunch of stuff away while they were really jacked up on the black drink. And it's theorized that this was a kind of out with the old, in with the new sort of ritual. Mm-hmm. I read one account of it that was basically imagine all the partying at Christmas and New Year's rolled into one. That was the black drink.
Sounds like a rager.
Yeah, right. They built like really long canoes. They built these really long, like 20 foot long canoes. They were very narrow. They were very accomplished at building those. They also had flint arrowheads, and they had other goods that had to come from inland. So they were part of the Native American trade networks that existed. They had some sort of diplomatic relations and trade relations with the people around them. Their building methods, however, and their largely mobile lifestyle means that they didn't leave a lot in the way of durable artifacts. But they did build shell middens as they collected like shellfish. Shellfish were a big part of their diet.
Wait, come again? They built what?
They built shell middens. Those are like mounds where they would pile up the shells from the shellfish.
Okay. Yep. Shell mound. Yep. I thought you said mittens, like
like cold weather gloves.
Yes. And I was envisioning like the tails of like lobster for each finger. And I was like, well, that's really more of a glove than a mitten. How would that work? What is he talking about?
No, not that. Not that. But in those shell middens, they have also found carefully and sort of reverently arranged skeletons of dogs. And so it's believed that they kept them as pets. Maybe they held them in some sort of like really high esteem. And so that's another part of their culture that we think maybe we know something about. Some Cape Fear Indians were recruited by the English as allies during the Tuscarora War, and between their involvement in various conflicts and the diseases the Europeans brought and displacement as they were pushed out of the area by European colonists, they faded pretty rapidly as a people. In 1600, it was estimated that there were about 1,000 people in their tribe. That was down to a couple of hundred by the early 1700s. They were down to 30 by sometime in the middle of the 18th century. And then by 1808, it's recorded that they had been eradicated. There was only one person left, and she was elderly. And at the time, they were described as having gone into South Carolina and potentially merged with the PD Indians. And it's noted that there was a lot of that sort of merging of tribes, especially among the Siouan people, because they needed numbers for defense.
Yeah, we've talked about that in other episodes, how groups will blend together and then all of a sudden a new group.
Yeah. Now let's talk about the legend, because the legend of the Maco Light starts with a figure named Joe Baldwin. According to the legend, and here I'm going to kind of average a bunch of the different versions of the legend together. I'll draw some distinctions here and there, but largely this is sort of like a summary and, sort of sum of the legends.
So this is the Friday the 13th, 2009 requel version, right?
Yes, totally.
Okay.
Joe Baldwin was a railroad conductor on the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad, which ran west from Wilmington to other communities and towns in the part of North Carolina that we refer to today as Down East. Mm-hmm. One of those communities is today called Maco, but back then it was called Farmers Turnout, or even earlier than that, it was called Rattlesnake, due to the large number of rattlesnakes that lived in the scrub woods in that area.
That is such a cooler name. They should have just kept it as Rattlesnake. Can you imagine? I live in Rattlesnake, North Carolina. You'd get people to move there just to say they were from there.
I sleep lightly in Rattlesnake, North Carolina. A long, gentle slope that was higher on the western end was called Rattlesnake Grade. That was a 4-mile long slope that raised the elevation 22 feet. So it's pretty gentle.
By North Carolina standards, I'm surprised they didn't call it a mountain. It's a joke about Purgatory Mountain being a hill.
Right. By the standards of the coast, that's a pretty significant increase in elevation, you know. So there's this like long, gentle slope called Rattlesnake Grade, and it leveled out in Rattlesnake, which is why it was called Rattlesnake Grade, where the railroad crossed Hood Creek, or in some versions that's referred to as Rattlesnake Creek. It depends.
Now they're just overselling it.
Now you're going to go there and be like super disappointed by how few rattlesnakes there are. That was also the tiny community of Maco, which was home to a few houses, a rustic general store, and a railroad platform where trains could stop for water and fuel on their way through. One dark night in 1867 or 1868, Baldwin was working on a train running west to east towards Wilmington. As the train descended Rattlesnake Grade, with the engineer taking like full advantage of gravity to assist, and the engine's fires going full blast, they were making good time towards Wilmington. And Baldwin, the conductor on the train, realized that something was wrong. In some versions of the legend, this is because he's just this tremendously skilled conductor and he just has a bunch of professional knowledge. But in some versions, he is credited with sort of having developed a sixth sense about the train because he's worked on trains for so long. Regardless, Baldwin is standing on the last car of the train, the caboose, when he realizes that the car has come uncoupled from the rest of the train, and he runs to the front to check to see whether he is still attached to the rest of the train, only to see the train disappearing into the night ahead of him.
Okay.
His car, he realizes, is now moving only by momentum and was already going slower than the train that had been pulling it. And that once it reached that long, flat stretch of miles between Maco and Wilmington, would very quickly come to a stop. And that might seem like an okay situation to be in because at least it's not going to crash into anything. But Baldwin knew the schedule for the Wilmington and Manchester line and thus knew that an express train was coming along right behind them and would, in mere minutes, come crashing into him. So he had to do something.
Something a friend of mine that worked on the railroad that listens to this show actually explained to me that it takes a great deal, and this is talking about modern trains, so I imagine the same was true with older trains, is that the amount of time that it takes to stop a train going at full speed and the amount of distance is not insignificant. So yeah, having a car stuck on the track in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
Because this is, in ye olden days, there it wasn't like he could hop on the radio and say, hey,
yeah,
I'm picking up what you're putting down.
There we go. So in some versions of this legend, the last car wasn't the caboose, which was basically the crew quarters on a train. You know, it had their bunks, it had all their supplies, it had their belongings, stuff like that. But in some versions, instead, it's a passenger car. And in that version, Joe Baldwin spends the intervening minutes trying to get everybody off the passenger car by like literally helping them to jump from the train.
Mm-hmm.
But in most versions, he's alone on this train car, and he realizes that his only hope is to signal the oncoming train and just hope that they can stop in time. He ran to the back platform of the last car, the car that he's on, and he began waving his lantern frantically over his head, trying to signal the train when it would come into view, just hoping for a miracle. And in all versions of the legend, the train that's coming is not able to stop. And it ends up slamming into him. He's waving his lantern the whole time, just like hoping against hope. And the train is trying to stop, but it can't stop in time. It smashes into the car that he's on, and he is instantly killed in the collision. He's not just killed, though. He's decapitated. His lantern goes flying off in one direction into the swamp, where, in every version of the legend, it lands upright and continues to burn throughout the night until a railroad worker finds it the next morning.
Mm-hmm.
His head flies off in the other direction. And the next morning, when the railroad crews are trying to clean up the accident, they are incapable of finding it.
Mm.
In the absence of his head.
In the absence of his head. That's a statement that you don't get to hear very often.
Right. The railroad paid to bury his headless corpse in a graveyard in Wilmington, gave his widow a pension, and said, what are you going to do? We're going to go right back to running trains through there because we have to. Like, they aren't going to move the railroad or anything, right past the spot where he died. But shortly after, word started to get around that residents of Maco, which, by the way, Maco has its own really fascinating history, and one day we're going to do an episode about what it's connected to. But later, some other day, people in Maco had started seeing a ghost light appear on the tracks right where the accident occurred. Not every night, not even most nights, but often enough that people would go looking to see if they could see it. And some nights they would say that a light would spring into existence in the location of the train accident. Then it would bob back and forth, sort of weaving from side to side, maybe a half mile down the tracks from where it came into being to the old trestle over the creek at the bottom of Rattlesnake Grade, then turn around and go back to its point of origin. And sometimes they said when it did that, they would see it then spin into the air and disappear into the swamp on the other side. And sometimes it just winked out of existence. But regardless, people immediately knew what was happening, and the story immediately became that Joe Baldwin's ghost had returned, lamp in hand, to search for his missing head.
As one would want to do.
Yeah, right.
Where's my noggin?
The light itself was described as being so bright that sometimes, according to legend, it did cause trains to stop. Stories surfaced over the years of more than one train believing that a collision was imminent, throwing on its brakes as it came down the grade and spinning a tense mile or two, trying to make sure that they stopped before they hit whatever was coming towards them, only to have the light go out as soon as they did so.
Only to have a grumpy ghost manifest with his hands on his hips and no head going, a little late.
Indeed. Let's get those brakes serviced, young man. So,
except that it can't talk because there's no head. So,
and a lot of people who went looking for it would say that it was bright enough to cast a reflective glow on the train tracks. It would light up the tracks well enough for people to see the tracks, see the cross ties, see the gravel of the train bed, the plants around it, and that there was no one carrying a lantern. In fact, according to the legend, President Grover Cleveland's train stopped at Maco Station on its way through the region. In some versions, Cleveland saw the light himself and later described it to others, but official records don't really back that up. In other versions, he notices that a train conductor at Maco Station had two signal lamps of different colors. And when he asked why, the conductor told him, oh, we have to carry two lanterns on this line and they have to be specific colors so that nobody will mistake our lanterns for the Maco light or vice versa. The railroad couldn't avoid public knowledge of the phenomenon, obviously.
Sure.
But neither could they stop using the line. So they put signs in the area to warn onlookers away from the tracks themselves.
Yeah.
People who went onto the tracks thinking that that would help them see the light or that they could chase it or things like that were really putting themselves in danger. And in fact, the rail line in the 40s said in a news article about this that young people ran the risk of joining Joe Baldwin in his search forever.
As someone that spent quite a bit of time messing around on railroad tracks and at one point lived across the street from railroad tracks where someone had cut a hole in the fence and CSX had to park a police car because they have their own police department, and CSX would park a car at the hole in the fence. Like, don't do this. It's a thing young people do. It's dumb, but it's a thing they do.
Yeah. The railroad changed hands many times over the next 60 or 70 years, and eventually it fell out of use altogether. And the village of Maco essentially emptied and was virtually abandoned. But people who knew the legend would still go to the site late at night and watch for the Maco lights to appear. And to this day, even though the trestle was demolished and the rail lines were pulled up and the Maco station was taken down, it is still supposedly possible to see Joe Baldwin walk the tracks on his quest.
So that's the legend.
That's the legend.
I have a lot of comments based on my limited knowledge of this, and I have so many questions. I was under the impression that the area had been developed at this point.
At which point?
October 2022, like the area had been like built up and developed.
Yeah, the landscape is very different now.
Okay. All right. And I was also under the impression that there was a road named after him or a cul-de-sac or something.
There is a town nearby that is a very small town. And if I remember correctly, the name is Sandy Creek. But if I'm wrong, then I will drop in the correct name right after this. I looked at a map of that town. I actually thought about calling their town hall and just asking, like, do people still see the light?
Right. Like, why do you have this name that?
Yeah. And then I was like, you know what? A Friday afternoon right before Halloween, I don't know if they need me calling them.
Probably not. Tell me about your ghosts.
Right. I might call them in a couple of weeks and see what they have to say. So, and if they do, then I'll follow up on that. But yeah, there is a road in that community that is named Joe Baldwin Drive.
But that is not where people should go.
No, that's just a road that's named after him.
Sure. Yeah. And I live on Boogeyman Court.
Right.
Like, except that now part of my elaborate Mega Millions or Powerball fantasy involves becoming a low-key developer and naming every street in a neighborhood after like various creatures and monsters and ghosts and legends. That would be an awesome neighborhood.
It would. But, you know, you think of like Duke Street in Durham.
Sure.
Duke Street is named for the Duke family, but it does not actually go to Duke University.
It's not named after the mayonnaise?
It's not named after the mayonnaise either. It's where the old mayonnaise factory is.
Right.
Sorry. Also, the angle on this is weird, so I'm not trying to loom.
You're fine. Loom and large, like the legend of the mayonnaise tree. That's where mayonnaise comes from.
Mayonnaise squeezins.
You gotta press the mayonnaise.
The mayonnaise orchard out on the edge of town. It's the old haunted mayonnaise orchard.
Right.
Ugh. Terrible.
Joe Mayonnaise.
So, the first known account was published in The State magazine in 1934.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, Charles N. Allen described his personal encounter with the Maco light after going there to see if the story was worth writing up for the magazine. And his account was this: a mile or more down the right of way, there is a flicker over the left rail, as if someone had struck a match. The eerie-looking thing sways a little and begins creeping up the tracks. Your eyes are magically glued to its movements. The thing comes on. It becomes brighter as its momentum increases. Then it begins dashing toward you with incredible velocity. Paralyzed, you just stand there waiting for the thing to rend you to pieces, but it never reaches you. It comes to a sudden halt, 50 or 75 yards from where you are standing. It glares at you for a moment like a fiery eye, then it speeds rapidly back down the tracks. It stops now where it first made its appearance and glows ominously there like a red moon in miniature. Then it vanishes into nothingness.
Huh, I like that. It's very evocative.
Yeah, isn't it? It's great stuff. It's a good account. The State editors accompany the article with a statement that they were skeptical to the point of hesitating to publish Allen's account. But they contacted people that they knew in Wilmington, and everybody they contacted, much like we ourselves hear about lots of stories like this and lots of places like this, were told, like all of their contacts told them it was real. Lots of people had seen it, and it was worth covering. A few years later, 1940, the Robisonian, a newspaper out of Robeson County.
Yeah, we've quoted them on some stuff.
Yes, absolutely. They published their own account of 5 men from Lumberton who went to Maco in 1940 to see if they could see the light, and did.
Oh, those Lumberton folks.
The state, Blue Velvet. The Statesville Record and Landmark ran an article in 1941 and said everyone in Maco called it Uncle Joe's Lantern, saying that at that point it had been attracting onlookers for half a century or maybe longer. And in a truly excellent book from 2020 called Curious Tales from Old Wilmington and the Lower Cape Fear, an author named Thonville, whose name I might be mispronouncing, notes that in a 1964 interview, an 83-year-old woman said that she had seen the light many times, starting when she was 5 or 6. So the mid-1880s, roughly, was when she started seeing the light. That was like the earliest she could remember seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
And that her own father told her that he had seen it a bunch of times in the years before that.
Huh. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I like it.
In 1948, a Wilmington businessman and folklorist named Lewis Moore wrote an article for the Wilmington Star-Journal telling the tale of Joe Baldwin losing his head, and referred to it as the Atlantic Coast Line's favorite ghost, because that's the name of the railroad at that point.
Yeah. That's great. He's a favorite.
Yeah, exactly. I love it.
People must have voted for him in the WRAL Voters' Choice Awards to get him that title.
They must have.
Much like you can vote for Arcane Carolinas.
Indeed. In that article, Moore notes that for several years, starting in 1873, people actually reported the appearance of 2 lights that raced towards each other on the tracks. Then, after an earthquake in 1886, both lights stopped appearing for a couple of years. And then the original singular light resumed its sort of more meandering search.
Weird.
Moore also claimed that a U.S. Army machine gun detachment from Fort Bragg had spent several nights camped out around the rail line in hopes of seeing the light. And as he put it, quote, to try and solve the mystery or at least perforate it. But Fonville notes there is absolutely zero evidence that actually happened.
Yeah, I can't imagine. It's just funny. Like, was that an official order? Like, go out there and look for the light, or was it like, we're on leave? What do you want to do? I want to go sleep next to the railroad tracks. Like, I don't see it happening either way.
According to Moore, it was an official action by the U.S. Army in order to attempt to solve the mystery.
All right, shows what I know. Beats picking up cigarette butts and washing trucks.
Yeah, in
the motor pool.
Our old friend Charles Wedby.
Oh, chuckles.
Picked up that little detail and ran with it. And blending into it that the machine gun unit actually fanned out to surround the light when it appeared to them, only to have it vanish before them, then reappear behind them and continue its route unimpeded. He also claims that they shot at it, but even Wedby says he's not entirely sure that's true. That said, there are lots of accounts of people taking guns out there and trying to shoot it, including a guy who thought he was shooting at the light and instead shot out his own windshield because what he was seeing was the moon reflected in it.
Good. I'm glad that happened. You dumb.
On October 28th, 1957, Life magazine published a version of the story as part of a Halloween series of articles they were running. But in it, they said that the legend was that it was Joe Baldwin's head searching for his body.
So that's the first thing I thought of when you were just like, and his head went and was never found. I recently did if you've listened to the show for a while, you know that I like to play a specific game this time of year, do like a playthrough. And I recently was doing my Simon's Quest playthrough, and, you know, there's little heads that will fly at you. And that's immediately what I thought of when you were like, and his head went flying. I was like, what if the light is his head?
Yes. As part of that story, Life published a photograph taken from just sort of ahead of the train trestle over the creek. And it shows a bright light off in the distance, and it shows a second light under the train trestle. But they didn't claim that this was a natural photograph. And everybody pretty much knows that this was like staged as an illustration for the article.
Mm-hmm.
It is also noted that by then the Maco station was in ruins. It was no longer used at all, and Maco had basically become a ghost town. But a month later, the Wilmington News sent reporters to the scene at night to see if they could witness the phenomenon. And one of their photographers captured a photo of an irregular, glowing blob of light in the distance, down the tracks, in front of, and like way far ahead of the reporters who were with him. And in that photograph, there is clearly a reflective glow on the old train tracks being cast by the Maco light with no other source of light around.
Wow, that's cool. I like that.
Yeah. This is also the era in which the light was described as, quote, brighter than a 25-watt bulb. And that's become a standard part of the description of the phenomenon ever since. In the 1960s and 70s, a bunch of newspapers in North and South Carolina ran stories about it. They sent reporters. Sometimes they would just try to mine it for like spooky season.
Yeah.
They especially ran articles in 1978 because in 1977, the train tracks, which were no longer in use at all, were completely removed. And after that, the Maco light sort of escaped into wider popular culture. There have been a bunch of like weirdly country songs written about it and bluegrass songs. And in part, that's because bluegrass in particular likes to feature train accident stories.
Yeah.
That's like one of the themes of a lot of bluegrass music. So it's sort of been known ever since then as sort of this bigger phenomenon that attracts people to go looking for it.
It's awesome. I like this one.
Oh, I loved this story. So my next question was, so what about Joe Baldwin?
Mm-hmm.
It's like most versions of this story take the Joe Baldwin loses his head in a train accident part just at face value. No pun intended. They just report it as completely true. They don't really ask questions about it. Wedby describes him as buried in a graveyard in Wilmington. Other writers say stuff like that he was buried specifically in Oakdale Cemetery in Wilmington, which is enormous and beautiful. And if you're into graveyards, you can literally spend all day wandering around in Oakdale. And I had a great time getting lost in there one time, but I will also note I could not find a restroom. So go prepared. Phoneville, however, like the guy who wrote the book in 2020 that covers this, it covers a lot of other stories, but it includes this as one of its stories. And I just have to say, I really like the cut of his jib as a writer. Also, there's another book that I will link to called Myths and Mysteries of North Carolina by a writer named Sarah Pitzer. I also really liked her take on things. They both take the attitude of, let's talk about the real history that we can find behind this. And in particular, Phoneville went digging. And he could not find one mention of Joe Baldwin or a fatality on that line in 1867 or 1868 or any of the years immediately around it.
Oh, really?
As far as he could tell, there was just no Joe Baldwin. Another writer whose book I read that I will reserve comment on, named Morris F. Britt, he points out that Baldwin was the name of a train engine manufacturer at the time. Not just a train engine manufacturer, but the biggest train engine manufacturer at the time. And trains that they manufactured were commonly referred to as Baldwins. I checked that out and it holds up. Baldwin Locomotive Works was the leading producer of steam engines in the United States from the 1820s to 1950. And in the middle of the 19th century, their largest market by far was Southern Railroad lines before the Civil War. And then during the Civil War, the U.S. Army. And immediately after the Civil War, the U.S. Army took possession of a bunch of rail lines in the Southeast because the Confederacy had taken possession of them and turned them into Confederate military rail lines. And so the odds are pretty good that if Baldwin were working a railroad line connected to Wilmington in the 1860s, that he would have been on a Baldwin train.
What if Joe Baldwin is just we did not plan this, but just making the joke, old Joe Mayo. What if it was just somebody that worked for Baldwin? And so they called him, that's Joe Baldwin over there. No, but I'm serious, right? What if they just called him whatever? Oh, yeah, that's Joe that works for Baldwin.
So I like that take on it, but it gets even better.
Okay. Go on.
Phoneville went even deeper into the research, and he found a doctoral dissertation written at UNC Greensboro in 2004 by James Burke, who was completing his PhD at UNCG. And in that dissertation, which was on the history of railroad lines, Burke documents that he also couldn't find a record of a Joe Baldwin dying in a train accident at Maco in the 1860s, but he could find documentation of a train conductor named Charles Baldwin, who, while working on the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad on the night of January 4th, 1856, was on a mail car being pulled west from Wilmington up Rattlesnake Grade. The engine of his mail train suffered some kind of fault, and the engineer detached the mail car so that he could take the rest of the train on ahead. Then he came back to get the mail car. But when he came back, returning down the grade, he went too fast and he collided with the mail car, and Charles Baldwin was thrown from it and killed by a head injury.
There you go. There it is.
Burke was able to find the newspaper notice at the time, which read, "The late railroad accident. A coroner's jury summoned by Coroner J.C. Wood to examine into the circumstances by which the late lamented Mr. Charles Baldwin came to his death after mature deliberation reported that it was occasioned by a blow received on the head on the night of Friday the 4th while acting as conductor on the mail train of the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad by a collision of the engine and mail train."
There it is. You found it.
So, yes, a man named Baldwin really did die in an accident where Rattlesnake Grade begins its climb from Maco. And yes, he really did die by a head injury. All credit to Phoneville, by the way, for digging that up in the course of writing his book. I highly recommend his book. I have linked to it in the show notes.
That's amazing. That's great.
Oh, yeah, I was so happy. So there have been a bunch of skeptics ever since the article in the State magazine appeared in 1934.
Well, sure. It's fantastical.
Yeah. And a bunch of people have said, well, it's just headlights reflected from the highway nearby.
Sure.
Or that old favorite, swamp gas.
I thought about the swamp gas when you said there was two and then they stopped after an earthquake. That did cross my mind. I was like, somebody's going to say this is swamp gas.
Totally. Others say that when Highway US 74/76 was built and the road was diverted away from Maco, that the lights disappeared and that this proves that it was headlights all along, quote unquote.
Headlights all along. I would have gotten away with it if you hadn't moved the highway.
But the lights have been seen since at least the 1880s and probably the 1870s and probably earlier than that. So just not headlights from cars. In fact, there wasn't even a drivable road through Maco until 1918. So Britt, who has a book called The Mysterious Maco Lights.
What's that book about?
Well, yeah, gee, I wonder. Mostly it's about other people's discussion of the Maco light, actually. It's really interesting. There are parts of that book that are really interesting reading, and then there are parts of it that are why I'm not linking to it in the show.
Yeah, is that the one you sent me a message about?
Yes.
Okay, I got you.
Britt puts forward an explanation, a theory that he considers scientific, and I consider even farther fetched than a ghost with a lantern looking for his head.
Okay.
But the fact is that people have been seeing and reporting this since way before cars. It doesn't act like swamp gas. All the other alternative explanations, which are things like electrical discharge or like reflections or the moon or ball lightning, like you name all the usual suspects, don't really fit what people have reported seeing over time. The closest thing to corroboration of some sort of ecological or geological or something explanation is, like you said, the earthquake thing, where like the event changed as a result of something in the environment and then it resumed later. But I'm not a geologist, so I don't know. I don't know what that is. There are some variation in the reports as well. Like some say that it's solid white, some say it's amber, some say it's red, some say it's green, some say it changes color as it moves. But everybody who sees it describes that bobbing, weaving motion as if someone were walking down the track carrying a bright light, bright enough to illuminate the ground around them and reveal that they are not there.
Big Brown Mountain Lights vibes.
Yes. And in every story about this, every book, every news article, everything, the Brown Mountain Lights get brought up. And sometimes the Bingham Light also gets brought up. So my question was, is the light real? And do people still see it? Like basically every story we've discussed. This is something that has been seen so many times by so many people that I think it's obvious that, yeah, I mean, the light is real and that people are seeing something, regardless of why it appears. Why it appears on some nights and not on others, nobody knows. What it is exactly, nobody knows. But obviously something is happening and people are experiencing it. And a lot like the Brown Mountain Lights or the ghost town of Goshen Hill or the vampire beast of Bladenboro or the devil's hoofprints in Bath or the devil's tramping ground, these phenomena exist. People have seen them. The media have covered them across generations. There's obvious and objective documentation of the reality that something is happening, even if no one agrees on what. And I really liked that in his book, Fonville himself tells of his own experiences with the Maco light. In the summer of 1969, he, two of his friends, and the mother of one of his friends went out there multiple times, and they saw the light twice. Once, he said, it was just, quote, a small radiant sphere that swung back and forth along the rail line several hundred yards where they had positioned themselves to kind of hope they would see it. And like they saw it and it moved around and then it went out, and that was that. But the second time he saw it, he says it approached them so quickly and was so bright that it frightened them, and they could see its reflection on the hood of their car. And then it zoomed away back down the tracks just as quickly as it approached and was gone.
Man, I would absolutely. I think I made a joke about like dudes on leave not wanting to go camp out by the railroad track. I would absolutely go camp out by the railroad tracks. I'd take a little folding chair and a little thermos of coffee and sit out there and see what's what.
And apparently that was very popular among teenagers in the region in the 1950s and 60s. They would go out in like groups, parties, and they'd go see if they could see the lights. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. And a lot of these accounts include like, oh, when I was in high school in the 50s, we went out there all the time, and sometimes we saw it and sometimes we didn't.
So cool.
In that same book, Fonville tells that he interviewed a man named James Joachim or Joachim.
Old JJ.
I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. So I'm going to say Joachim. And if that's wrong, my apologies.
It's mayonnaise.
There we go. He lived in Winston-Salem in the 1950s, and he had friends who worked at Bell Laboratories in their offices at that city.
Ooh.
So he told his friends that he had gone out there a bunch of times looking for the Maco light and had seen it because his wife's family lived nearby and they would go visit them. And whenever they went to visit, they would go out on the railroad tracks and see if they could see the Maco light. And he would many times. So those friends who worked for Bell Labs, they outfitted him with an infrared camera and a tripod, and they showed him how to use it so that he could try to get photos with infrared film.
Yes.
In 1954, Joachim said he went out on the trestle. He set up his camera, the infrared camera, and he waited. And with that camera, he got 3 photographs of the Maco light. In one of them, it is shining so brightly that it illuminates the rails under it, the trees around it, and a telephone pole that can be made out. In those 3 photos, which are reproduced in Fonville's book and are fascinating, he gets those photos, he packed everything back up, and he started walking back to his car. And then he realized that there was a light beginning to shine over his shoulder from behind. And he still had 50 yards to get back to the car and was very concerned that a train was coming because he was doing the dumb thing of going out there and standing on the railroad tracks. So he spun around to see, was it a train coming? And instead it was the Maco light. And it was right on top of him. He said it was bigger and brighter than he'd ever seen it. And it was very close. And as he put it, he made, quote, a record run back to his car with the tripod and the camera and everything and got out of there. And when he printed the photos, there was a gorgeous photograph of the Maco light.
That's great. It's almost like it knew he was taking photos. Hey, come closer. You want to get my good side.
Right. I'm ready for my close-up.
Right. Where are you going? Come back.
But people have mostly claimed that after the railroad was physically removed in 1977, the lights stopped appearing. Mm-hmm. And you see that in a lot of versions of this story. Fonville says that himself in his book, and he refers to other publications like more articles from Wilmington newspapers as recently as the 2000s that say that the light is no longer seen. And by the 1970s, the old site of the train station had been cleared, and there was a large mobile home park that had been put in there. And there were reports from the 70s that it was impossible to even tell whether the light was appearing because there were so many night lights installed as part of that mobile home park. But a 1978 account that I read described a reporter sitting on the hood of his car, waiting to see if the light still appeared, when he heard a menacing voice threaten him from behind. When he turned around in fright, he saw a local standing there asking him if he had had car trouble. When the reporter said, no, I'm just out here watching for the Maco light, the guy was like, oh, okay, well, have fun, and turned around and walked away. And then when the reporter turned back around to resume his watch, he heard someone laughing from the trees and bushes nearby and decided to get out. He wasn't sure whether he was hearing a ghost, whether he'd been threatened by somebody, was it a prank? He didn't know. He was out of there. But there are other reports of people seeing the lights after 1977. They are pretty few and far between, but they exist. These days, that rail bed is very nearly grown over completely. It is worth noting, in relevance to your comment about being very ready to go out there yourself, that is all now private property. They have a ton of no trespassing signs, and a lot like the Bingham light, this is now a dangerous place to go. So do not go poke around there if you are one of our listeners who likes to go to the places we talk about. That's awesome. Don't go to this place. Unless you know who owns the land and can get their permission. Don't go to this place.
That'd be cool. I'd still be game for it if we got permission.
Oh, if we had permission, that's great. No problem. But don't go out there and just poke around. I would remind you also that this community was once called Rattlesnake because of all the rattlesnakes there. So, and in fact, on modern maps of the area, that creek is still called Rattlesnake Creek or Rattlesnake Branch.
So you go in the winter, right? Because it's cold, and I'll stop. I'll stop.
Pitzer, in her 2012 book, describes that as recently as 2007, a paranormal group called NC Hags. I'm not sure that they're still active. They still have a Facebook account, but they haven't posted anything publicly in a few years. And if they are, and they happen to hear this by some wild chance, then I really enjoyed your videos.
Is Hags an acrenym, or are they we're just a bunch of hags?
It's an acronym.
Okay.
Yeah.
I prefer to think of cartoon style hags.
Right. Their website doesn't exist anymore. Their old domain name that she references in her book doesn't go anywhere these days. Okay. But nobody's posted anything on their Facebook account in 8 years. But just in case they're out there, I really liked what they had to say about themselves also, and the things that I read about them in the course of researching this, because they talk about how they don't want to go get a TV show. They don't want to be the star. They don't want it to be about them. When they did investigations, they would only ever use their own first names in reports or when talking to reporters, because they didn't want it to be, look at me, I'm the famous person who did the brave thing of going to the place and hollering at ghosts. Instead, they were we're trying to help people who are experiencing something, so we want to make it be about their experience rather than about our personalities, which I think is really admirable. They also had the same rule that we do of no cussing. because they knew that there were like kids who would watch this and they wanted that to be something that they could enjoy. So in 2007, they had a couple of local guides. I'm going to presume that they had permission also.
Sure.
They went out there and did a couple of videos. They took some no-flash photos. They recorded video of themselves exploring the area. And in one of their parts of their investigation, they called out to Joe Baldwin's ghost.
My name is Charles.
Their daylight photos show the old rail line is this just like barely cleared, barely walkable path through the woods. It's kind of hard to even realize that it's a path.
It's kind of like the Cattsburg ghost train line in Durham. Like you really got to know where to look to find it.
Big time. Like there's still gravel in a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's so much scrub. There's so many trees and shrubs all over the place.
Yeah.
It's hard to know exactly what it would be. But in one of their photos, they say that after they said aloud, Joe, if you want to show yourself, now would be a good time, that they got images of glowing green stuff ahead of them on the trail.
Ectoplasm.
And like they posted a video in 2007 on YouTube. And because the internet is forever, that video still exists. So that is also linked from the show notes. But you can kind of, if you like squint at it right, see that maybe it's the outline of a person. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just something in the air. You don't really know.
Tell you what it is. It's old Joe Mayo.
It might be.
Old Chuckles Baldwin.
So lots of sources, like I said, report that sightings slowed down after the railroad tracks were removed. And even the places where they say, like, no, sightings still happen, they say they're much less common now. But I don't necessarily think that it stopped. And I'm not even convinced that it slowed down. I think people heard that it stopped and mostly stopped going looking for it. And then it became inaccessible. And so then people really stopped going looking for it. And so, like, of course, there are fewer reports now. You can't drive down the access road that's next to the railroad tracks and go look for it these days because the access road is gone. The railroad tracks are gone. You have to know where they are. The highway got routed away from that part of Maco. So you don't drive past them anymore if you just drive past where Maco is/was. And so, like, I don't think that the infrequency of reports indicates that it's not still happening. I think it means that there aren't people there to see it.
I would buy that. Yeah. If it's inconvenient, as many people aren't going to go.
Yeah. And I don't know what it is. I don't know that it's the ghost of Charles Baldwin looking for his head. I don't know that it's the firefly explanation that was put forward by Britt. I don't know that it was any of the things that I have read. All I know is that people for, at this point, well over 150 years have been reporting seeing something out there, and that there are similar lights like it in all sorts of places all over the Carolinas. And that I'm not the person who's going to figure out what it is. I'm just really glad it exists.
Yeah, I love the story. I love the history behind it. I love that you figured out who the real guy is.
I didn't figure it out, but...
Okay. Yeah, you didn't figure it out. Okay. I'm glad you told me.
Yes. I just don't want to take credit for other people's work.
Yeah. No, I gotcha. You can cite sources and still have it be a part of your work.
Totally.
So thank you for the research on this. This was great. This is fun. I like this one. This is the perfect ending to our third spooky season.
Yeah, I feel like this is a really good one to greet Halloween on.
Yeah.
I have no idea if Charles Baldwin is out there waiting to find his head, but if he is, I hope he finds it.
Maybe it's his head looking for his body.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
You never know.
So yeah, thank you to everyone that has been with us for this spooky season, whether it's your first one or your third one. We're glad you're here. We have some plans for the near future. Most immediately, we'll be sharing some interviews that we did at the Upstate Spirit Conference, as well as a live episode in November. So that'll be cool. We have something for December that we're still, ironing out details on, but we'll let you know. And then the next big thing, I would guess, would be Retcon, right?
Yeah, Retcon in February.
Yeah. And if you're listening to this before November 20th, please do consider voting for us in the WRAL Voters' Choice Awards.
Absolutely.
A link is in the show notes, or you can go to wral.com/VCAS. Yeah. If you want to drop us any tips or leads or any of that stuff, please do it. We love hearing from people, even if it's just to say hi. We're always happy to send a sticker out.
And we've gotten a couple of really good leads lately on some potential future Arcane destinations.
Yeah. Roadmap for 2023 is full, which is
one day.
Yeah, it was kind of funny. I was sort of organizing that because it's like, all right, take a breather, for November. Pretty much all the content's already done. We've got some other work that we need to do. It's like, but let me just sketch out what we need to work on next, so I know what I should be doing. And next thing you know, 2023's calendar was completely full. And I was like, oh, crap.
Yeah, no, it's pretty busy. We're already booked up, basically. But it'll be a lot of fun.
It will absolutely be fun. So happy Halloween, everybody.
And thanks for listening.
That bop slapped. You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thanks for joining us. If you liked it, give us a rating, leave a comment. If you didn't like it, send us an email and tell us why. If you're not wrong, we'll try to fix it.
And if you're interested in award-winning speculative fiction, including science fiction, urban fantasy, and horror, find me, Michael G. Williams, at michaelgwilliamsbooks.com, and check out Falstaff Books at falstaffbooks.com.
If you'd like to pick up some Arcane Carolinas merch, look at behind-the-scenes info, pictures, videos, stuff like that, all the things that get cut, check out arcanecarolinas.com, where you can get access to our Patreon, our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram, all that in one place, including the merch store. Buy a shirt.
Clothe your body.
Drape your body in our wares.
Be our living billboards.
Big Miracle Whip is going to come for us next. They're like,
big salad dressing. So,
quick aside while we're on the topic, because we're way off track now. Have you ever had the they call it, it's like sandwich spread? It's this craft sandwich spread. It's like almost like a light orange in color, and it's got like a bunch of like peppers and stuff like mixed into it.
I've never had that.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Anyway,
okay.
I don't like I can't put mayonnaise on anything myself. Like
I'm not a mayonnaise person.
No. But if I'm like out and order like a club sandwich and it comes with mayo on it, I'm like, it's fine. It's just something to do with the way it like scoops out of the jar. I can't do it.
All right. My mother is a big mayonnaise fan, so no. Yeah. That said, I'll use it in certain things. You got to use it in certain things.
Sure. I mean, it has to be used in certain things, but I will not put it on a sandwich. If there is a dish that requires mayonnaise, I'll generally be like, somebody else make this.
Yeah. There are like a few things that we make that involve a little bit of mayonnaise, and it's always on the grocery list as smallest possible container of mayonnaise.
Mayonnaise.
It's just like, ugh. So
anyway,
the history of the legend
of mayonnaise, of Joe Mayonnaise.
Joe Mayonnaise who lost his mayonnaise jar. Now he searches the woods for it. Give me just a second.
Sure.